And so now that I've said that, Ella will begin the recording. Following the talk, there will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Stott questions. And please feel free to submit your questions throughout the talk using the chat function. And I'll then try and collate those submitted questions and put them to Dr. Stott on your behalf following this presentation. Okay, now that I've given you all the housekeeping information, it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker to you. So Dr. Neil Stott is a faculty professor in management practice, director of the Master of Studies in Social Innovation program, and co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. Dr. Stott is a fellow of the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society and adjunct professor, Faculty of Business Administration in Newfoundland, Canada. In 2017, he won the University of Cambridge Vice-Chancellor's Public Engagement with Research Award. He was Chief Executive of the Keystone Development Trust until April 2015, and prior to that, he worked in local government, charity, and community projects. Neil, I'm handing over to you now, and I'll start sharing your screen.
Thank you, and nice to see you all here today. I see quite a few of my colleagues, students past and present from the Masters. Thank you for joining. So, good. So if you can move first, please. So I'm going to talk about social innovation in the pandemic and beyond. But before I do that, I just want to say how honoured I am to be speaking at Dr. Anna Bidder's talk. I read some of her obituaries the other day, and this little quote from The Guardian really struck me. So for any of you who are social innovators or involved in making social change, you know, describing how she and her colleagues worked to set up Lucy really resonated with me. This is what our work is all about. And when we think about it, it can be long, arduous, it's about sacrifice, and unfortunately, there's discouragement along the way. So I thought it was a very nice quote. Moving on, please. So I have spent 30 years of my career as a practitioner in different settings, interspersed with study, and more recently working at the Judge, setting up the Centre for Social Innovation with Professor Paul Tracy, who's with us this evening. So I balance sort of practitioner, study, and academia over my career. So I've got some insights, I would hope, to what has been happening around social change and how to make social change, particularly at the grassroots level. Next slide, please. The plan is to talk a bit about social innovation. I know lots of you know about it, but just to remind you, run through our own leadership framework and then think aloud about social innovation and the pandemic. Next slide, please. So just so we know where we're starting, this is our definitions. So Paul and I developed this a couple of years ago. Fairly simple, fairly clear. You know, social innovation as the development of creative and practical solutions to complex social problems. Now, those who are involved in academia who are students know how people can argue endlessly about definitions. And, you know, there are many other ways of describing it, but this is as simple and as clear as we can get it. And the important thing about this definition, it involves the word novelty or new, which does feature a lot when people talk about social innovation. This definition recognizes that we need to think about past as well as present in terms of how we create solutions to problems. You'll also note that our definition of social change organizations is very broad. We're not saying charities, we're not saying social enterprise. You know, a lot of organizations can be framed as social change organizations, which I'll come back to a bit later on. Next slide, please. So pre-COVID, what were the drivers for social innovation? I mean, social innovation as a term sort of came from nowhere in the 2000s. It's actually quite an old term. It was developed after the French Revolution and became very popular for a while and then sort of disappeared until fairly recently. So the key drivers were the crash of 2008 and people criticizing capitalism, the fear and hope of the generations thereafter. In UK in particular, austerity, so cuts to public services, meaning there were gaps left in services. A generational shift that people started to think more and more about wanting to do well as working in big corporations or whatever. I should also add there's been an international shift as well. Social innovation has spread across the world incredibly quickly. Countries like Vietnam, where I've taught social innovation, China to a certain extent, it's one of these ideas that spread very quickly. And the final and very important driver for us is wicked problems. Next slide, please. Now, a wicked problem is a problem that is pretty damn large. It is contested often, both the problem and how to solve it. It is very complex. It is a problem that it's going to be multi-generational. It'll impact us, our children's children, and so on and so on. And often no one organization, sector, or the state can tackle wicked problems alone. Now, the classic, next slide, please, is climate change. So climate change is a classic wicked problem. It is contested, hopefully less so now that a certain president has departed, but it's still contested. No one's absolutely clear on what the solution could be. What we choose to do has implications on the future because we won't know if it's going to work or not. But the thing about climate change, it's a cluster of wicked problems. It's also about issues like lack of water. It's about issues like biodiversity or lack thereof. It's about migration as climates change. So it's a cluster of very, very challenging problems that we as social innovators are, trying to address, in our own small way. Next slide, please. So the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation, which was set up in late 2014, early 2015 by Professor Paul Tracy and myself at the business school. We aim to do three things. The unofficial strapline is think, teach, do. So we do research, we teach, we have the masters, amongst other things. But importantly, we also have active engagement with people often outside the university. And that is Cambridge Social Ventures, where we incubate social enterprises. Next slide, please. And in thinking about our work, when we set up the masters and the centre, we have a framework we use which looks at social entrepreneurship, social intrapreneurship, and social extrapreneurship. If you want to know some more of the detail, there's a link there to an essay we wrote in 2017. Next slide. So social entrepreneurship, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's the process of creating and growing a venture, either for profit or not for private profit, I think that should read, where the motivation of an entrepreneur is to address social challenges. It's an idea that has been developing and growing and again globalizing since the mid to late 1990s. There were precursors, people used to call them community enterprises, or even before that, the cooperative movement. But that is the essence of what people are trying to do when they say they're setting up a social enterprise. Next slide, please. So one quick example is Harry Specter's. Now, if COVID had not got in the way, for those of you who live or visit Cambridge, you would have seen a Harry Specter's shop, I think in the Grafton Centre. Harry Specter's makes chocolates. Harry Specter's makes some of the best chocolates you'll ever taste. But Harry Specter's is not purely about chocolate. It was set up to give employment to young people with autism, because the couple who set it up, their son was autistic and was struggling to get work. So, they're selling very expensive chocolates, which makes a surplus so they can afford to employ people who have additional challenges. So that's a great example of one of our social enterprises. Next slide, please. Now, social entrepreneurship takes the story into organizations. So particularly, corporates, but also NGOs and big public sector organizations. It's about how to make change within organizations. Now, for those of you who've worked in big organizations, especially perhaps in the lower echelons, you will know that making change, social or otherwise, is really quite a challenge. And social entrepreneurs are quite special people. Next slide, please. One of our students from our third cohort set up a thing called the Circle of Entrepreneurs. It was the Circle of Young Entrepreneurs, but he got over 30 and had to change that. But the Circle of Entrepreneurs, and this is a slide from their deck, these are sort of organizations that they have members in. So you can see, huge companies, Mars, Google, Barclays, Unilever, where there are people trying to make a change about how those companies work with the world, how they do things in the world that reflects those young people's identities and wishes and values. So that's social entrepreneurship in a nutshell. Next slide, please. Now, social entrepreneurship is something actually we made up or borrowed, frankly. But we felt something was missing, and this is the people and the organizations and they're making the connections. So it's inter-organizational action. It's people who are creating resources, networks, platforms, ideas to connect people to tackle social challenges. And these people are really quite important as well. One thing we've realized since we wrote the essays, that actually some organizations, some people are doing all three things at once, or at least two of these things. But these are key components of our sort of thinking. Next slide, please. So one example is Cambridge Social Ventures, which is our own incubator. And here's a cluster of organizations that we have taken to incubation. So Cambridge Social Ventures is the social entrepreneur supporting the social entrepreneurs, be it Harry Specters or whatever. So organizations that are quite small to really quite big organizations at a global level. Next slide, please. Now, one problem that sort of emerged and has been emerging is the idea that to create social change, one has to use enterprise in different shapes or form. And we do question whether that we should really be purely focusing on that approach as we move forward. Next slide, please. There has been a rise in entrepreneurship models. Next, please. But it's important to note there is no one way to make social change. If we think that social enterprise is the only way, we are sadly misguided. There are many different ways. It could be a social movement. It could be a public sector initiative. It could be an NGO. It could be a campaign. By having one size fits all approach, which people tend to gravitate to social enterprise because it's a legitimate form, means it can close down other options, other ways of organizing, which I'll come back to in a second. Next slide, please. So moving on to COVID. Next. So obviously COVID has been a shock to the system, individually, as a country, and also as globally. And it has affected a lot of people in many, many, many ways. But in this very good book, Epidemics and Society, Snowden reminds us that, like all pandemics, COVID-19 is not accidental or random. We as humans often, and also humans as societies, as groups, have created vulnerabilities, and these viruses and bacteria they exploit the vulnerabilities that we have created in the environment. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I'm a great believer in looking at the long view of things, as my students, many of you in the audience know. I see the yawns occasionally in class. So I spent a very happy few weeks building up into this talk, thinking and reading some of the history, and I think it's rather gloomy, but history of pandemics, and in particular how people and societies react to pandemics over the years. For those of you interested, I'd definitely recommend Epidemics in Societies. It has a lot of very key insights. Next slide, please. Now, what it seems to be common across the experience is, number one, pandemics tend to be linked with exploitation of people or the planets, be it cutting down rainforests and creating opportunities for viruses to jump species, be it colonization and an impact of smallpox on the North American continent, which was immense. So there does seem to be a link between exploitation. I mean, if you look at cholera in particular, cholera has often been seen as disease of poverty. So where a lot of people are living in terrible conditions, you tend to get epidemics of cholera and other things. But the flip side is that the pandemics have often been a driver for public health and social justice. A lot of effort has gone in to think about how we can, improve the life chances of individuals and communities and societies, and how to improve our conditions. And a lot of things that we value, like a flushing toilet or clean streets, have come from a drive from public health. Now, as social innovators, many will know that you have to be careful of what you wish for. Sometimes the public health approaches have not been necessarily always beneficial, but many of them have been really, really important to us and people across the globe. The other thing that seems to happen is that we forget very quickly. A terrible event occurs, be it COVID or be it the so-called Spanish flu, which wasn't Spanish, but people forget very quickly, and governments forget, politicians forget, and the guard drops, and certain practice happen that allows other things to become worse as time goes by. The other unfortunate thing is that human behaviors tend to be very similar. We have examples of great sacrifice by health workers or sanitation workers. We've also examples of things, people running for the hills, of people, hoarding. These behaviors are not necessarily new. They've happened in many of the previous pandemics that we've experienced. But one thing I think, unfortunately, is clear, that pandemics, be it viral or bacterial, are likely to be fellow travelers of 21st century wicked problems. It's highly likely that if with climate change and access to water, etc., there will be other pandemics following that sort of occurrence. Something we have to be very, very aware of. Next slide, please. So this talk has been a team effort, and part of it is in preparation for an essay that Paul and I hope to write on this topic. So one thing we did was we had a workshop in our residential with our students on their thoughts as a global body of students, their thoughts on how COVID-19 in particular had impacted on them, their communities, etc. We'll start with the negative. And Dr. Farver, one of my colleagues, Michelle, drew this, the words of one of the students. The mantra is, we're all in the same boat. Unfortunately, depending where you are in the world, some people in nice yachts, some in a dinghy, and unfortunately others are in cold water. The experience of a pandemic, COVID or otherwise, is not the same for everybody. You know, different people have different opportunities, life chances, and access to key services. Next slide, please. So COVID has also made other issues invisible. Because it's so on our mind, because it's such a threat to us and our families and our communities, it has tended to dampen down other issues that are equally important. Not a surprise, but something we should be aware of. It's also accelerated existing trends. So things like high streets emptying out, shops shutting, Amazon and other platforms, posing even more of a threat to the high street, etc., etc. So those trends are already there, have been accelerated by the recent pandemic. But crucially, inequality has been brought into sharp relief. As you see, as we work through the pandemic, as we hear reports, etc., you can see that some people, particularly because of their race and gender and class, COVID has hit a lot harder than those of us who are privileged enough to spend the year and a half in a sort of gilded open prison. Many people have suffered, not just obviously the deaths, unfortunately, but other things: lack of work, lack of opportunity, domestic violence has been increased incredibly. The debt people are getting into. So the pandemic has compounded those sort of divisions. And something else which I think is incredibly important is and also the students did, is it has shown up the weakness of the international infrastructure. I don't know if any of you know about the doomsday clock, which the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set up in 1946 to show how close to midnight, doomsday, we were because of nuclear bombs, etc. What is interesting, the clock also goes back. The clock goes back when international treaties come into being. And if we think of this sort of pandemic clock, we have been very close to midnight because the international, not necessarily to doomsday, but to terrible things happening, because the international rules, regulations, behaviors, and monies was undermined for at least a decade, if not more, by leading politicians who decided not to invest in that sort of approach. What has that meant? Well, it's meant squabbling. It's meant inequalities in terms of who gets vaccinations. So rich countries getting it before poorer countries, and also sharing of information, also planning for the future. So I think it's a very, very important aspect of what's been happening of late. Next slide, please. But my students are incredibly positive people, so they also turn to what has improved. There has been increased collaboration, especially at local and regional levels, incredible collaboration between organisations to try and make a difference. I can see James Gemmell's here. He works the county council in Cambridgeshire. They've been doing incredible amounts of work to trying to mobilise their resources and other people's resources to tackle the issue and provide support to people. So that's been a really good thing. Digitalisation, the positive aspects have been accelerated as people switch how they do things. And to a certain degree, red tape has vanished in certain places. The ability to get things done has sped up, or some things, which is positive. Next slide, please. People have reconnected with place, maybe their daily walks or whatever it may be, that people suddenly felt we need to, explore our immediate surroundings because it's all we have available to us. There has been a lot of grassroots action, so people helping each other, real flurry, especially initially, it sort of waned somewhat, but, there's a lot of that activity. And I think a very important point again is what appears impossible became possible. So who would have imagined If I'd said 2 years ago, I think we should all work at home for a year. I don't think we should go to the office. I think I can work in half of my pajamas and a shirt, and that's perfectly fine. And we're all going to do it. You'd have all laughed at me and probably run me out of town. Okay? It's happened. Okay, so certain things have happened that we did not think was possible. That's quite an important point for a bit later on. And the other thing I think is incredibly important, and again, this is not news to my students who are, again, more rigid on this topic, it's the role of the state and the public sector, which in our circles at least was sort of demoted somewhat to the role of the corporate and also the sort of social sector, the social enterprise sector. The public sector's had a battering over the last couple of decades. So we've suddenly seen how important the public sector is to our lives. Not least, it has constrained us, social control aspect, but it's also been crucial in making sure that stuff happens to protect us, to sort out vaccines and to coordinate activity. So I think that's been an incredibly important aspect of this current crisis. Next slide, please. So just thinking quickly about, using our typology, I talked to our other team and they came up with some ideas as well. So when we think about social enterprise and what's happened to them over the last year and a half, I mean, obviously, many of them are and remain fragile. That is not a surprise. They are micro-organizations, they're startups, they tend to be fragile anyway. But for some, obviously, COVID has pushed them over the edge and there has been some closures. One quite famous one that won our national prize last year, cracked it shut. They had young people fixing mobile phone screens. It was award-winning social enterprise. It shut. Some have paused. So Mamuk, another one of ours, which was selling clothes, ethical clothes, has paused activity for the time being for a number of reasons. Next slide, please. Some have shifted in their delivery methods. So Safe Soulmates is a relatively new member of Cambridge Social Ventures that provides sort of dating and other services to people with different abilities. They move purely to an online service, which actually the people using it like better. And we're not seeing a lot of pandemic-related social enterprises coming yet. What we're seeing is that people are using more digital tools like Be Extra, which is a group of people who, I think artists, obviously COVID shut down opportunities, they came together to find new markets for their work. So we're seeing people reposition a bit, but we're not seeing a lot of pandemic related. We're seeing our usual amount of digital, mental health, etc. Who knows in the future? Maybe people will start work in this area. Next slide, please. As far as corporate social innovation goes, again, we haven't seen a lot of change. We did see companies and banks changing practices to make things easier for people in crisis. One example is PG Tips, worked with Re-Engage, which provides one-to-one support to vulnerable people. You can see the link, cups of tea, supporting each other, having a chat. So it's a pretty good marketing ploy, but there is some stuff going on. And you've seen a lot of money going into philanthropy through, Twitter, the leader of Twitter, and obviously the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have earmarked huge amounts of money to tackle COVID and future pandemics. But it's been a bit quiet. I'm sure some of my colleagues could give other examples, and please do, of where corporate social innovation has continued or shifted in the light of the pandemic. Next slide, please. One thing I came across the other day, which I thought was really interesting, and this is from Hitachi, the research institute, where they're thinking very seriously and having lots of conversations about, how we organize things in the past and how it might look like if we want to create sustainable societies moving forward. I'm pretty sure this work was happening anyway in relation to the ESGs, which is the environmental sustainability goals, but it came to this fore quite recently. So if a big company like Hitachi are looking at these issues, that's a positive sign, I think, for the future. Next slide. And social entrepreneurship. Well, the people quickest out of the box have been the environmental organizations. So people like WWF, well, and others, you know, have been very quick to point out the link between this pandemic, future pandemics, and devastation of the environment. And one example here is the Preventing Future Pandemics, which is a coalition of organizations. They're very quick to organize. And the other one, which is a good news story, is, so I mentioned Cracked It. They have repositioned themselves. So they shut down their social enterprise. Now they move to a model where they are incubating others to do their work, to do work in the space of young people and keeping young people out of Her Majesty's prisons. So that's a good news story as well. So let's just think in the final few minutes before I open up to questions about beyond the pandemic. So Professor Paul Tracy provided this graphic for me. So when we think about the future, we shouldn't think of it as one thing. There are different futures ahead of us, depending on the choices that we make. Okay, within the limits of plausibility, although actually we have pushed the limits of plausibility somewhat, given we're all sitting here working from home. This is particularly important because, you know, in the last couple of decades, people have seemed to run out of alternatives. We have a paucity of alternatives about how we think about the economy and society. Okay, it's increasingly sort of this one size fits all. We have a certain form of capitalism, and then we have people like us who try and stick the band-aid on when it goes wrong. You know, so we've got a bit, you know, we're not as imaginative as we might be about alternative futures. So I think a key message is we need to sort of hone our imaginations as we move forward. Next slide, please. So, you know, one future could be we go back to normal, as in, you know, everything is like it was before, or a new normal where it's broadly the same, but we have to wear masks and maybe keep away from each other a little bit, which would be somewhat of a shame because, again, as I said, social innovators will be there as a band-aid when things go wrong. And although people and organizations are doing good where they can, they're on the margins. You know, social innovation may be a center at Cambridge University, but frankly, it is still on the margins. And it's at the margins of a system that puts a premium on economic value over anything else. It's quite unpopular to say I put a premium on economic value these days. Unfortunately, what people say and what people do are often very different things. Next slide, please. So, you know, something that is hopefully possible and definitely preferable is that we see the pandemic as a sea change in the way we think about social value, how we think about each other, how we treat each other, how we work together, and what we think is important. And if that's the case, what sort of social innovation would we need to sustain it? The second thing is that organizations of all types, be it public, be it social, be it corporate, take seriously the implications of their action for the people and planet, as well as, or even before, they think about creating and capturing economic value. So there's a phrase from a German sociologist, Ulrich Beck, who used a phrase quite often about hope embedded in despair. You know, we have a lot to despair about. A lot of trends are very negative. You know, there's a lot of things that we could cause a lot of problems in the future, wicked problems getting wickeder. What we have to pin is the hopes. How are we going to move forward? Now, for me, if I was asked, and as I've got your attention, I'm going to say anyway, is for me, it's about ideas. It's about experimentation. And it's then about taking the best and implementing those ideas and turning them into practice. And for me, again, it'll be more local. It'll be about moving less, consuming less, and using technology to make sure that we can deliver decent living conditions for all without destroying the planet for all in the process. It's a big ask, I know. Next slide, please. And this is Dr. Farver. During one of our lectures, I was giving a lecture. She decided to put this to the students as I was speaking. This is me moving from despair to hope, seemingly. So there you are, a metamorphosis. So that's a running, a quick session on thinking about social innovation, the pandemic and beyond. I think we just touched the surface. Really interested in any comments and ideas, either now or later. Like I said, we're hoping to write some of this up into an essay in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Okay, Neil, thank you so very much for a really, really interesting talk, really thought-provoking. And it's a great feeling to have you as one of our fellows in Lucy Cavendish. So I think I'm going to open the floor to questions. And there are some questions.
Ruth Dog has got a question. It just appeared. Ruth Jones' dog had a question. I just saw it.
Yeah. Yes.
There's a question from Rosie Wright, who's being very formal, as she's one of my students.
Okay.
Do you think there'll be a backlash against change?
Yeah.
Rosie, is it backlash from people against people like us, or what do you mean, Rosie?
So I suppose I'm thinking that you said there's kind of been a trend, the popularity of social innovation is growing. And I wonder if people might be tired of change, tired of innovation, because we're so desperate for things to go back to normal. And I wondered if you thought that might become a bit of a counter movement to what we're trying to do at the centre.
That's a very interesting question. So, it's very interesting. Social enterprise and social innovation appeals across political spectrums. Okay, it's one of these things that seems to attract people from very different ideas. And social enterprise had somewhat of a free ride. I mean, how else would it appear in countries like Vietnam and China, as well as the US and the UK, very, very different places? But there will be a point, and I think the quote I put up from Dr. Bidder, from her obituary early on, reflected that. There are people who will resist any change. And when things get difficult, the resistance will get harder and harder. If you hit these, the sacred cows where it hurts, if you suggest that people should be taxed more, for instance, quite heavily, you will get reaction. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think we can go through life in organizations or in movements and expect to be liked by everybody. I don't think that's how change happens. So I think we have to be ready for resistance and counter activities. Rachel.
Rosie, are you happy with that answer?
I am, thank you. I wondered if Dr. Stott had any suggestions on how we make sure that we're ready, that we're resilient enough for.
Well, there's another thing. So, and I said this in class to students. So, one thing about social innovators in the current generations, very positive, very motivated, but not all of them have experienced resistance. A lot of young people I teach, particularly in other classes, not necessarily my own classes, think that if they, work hard enough, feel enough, be nice enough people, change will happen. But when the door starts shutting in their face, it gets a bit tricky and, people can drift off. The Circle of Young Entrepreneurs have experienced this of late. They talk about the corporate immune system, you know, turning on them quite quickly when they try to make change. So I think if you know, someone who's sort of been at it for a number of years like myself, or you've asked anyone else who've been involved in, you know, long campaigns or in different movements, you know, I think resilience is knowing about when to take the successes, you know, when knowing, you know, when to compromise, and knowing that you can't change everything. Sometimes you just can't do what you wish to do. Okay.
Thank you.
Rachel Moriarty. You had a question?
Yeah, my question was, you mentioned that you haven't seen so many kind of new pandemic-related enterprises and social innovations pop up. Would you perhaps hypothesize that that might be because some of the action that has happened and been pandemic-focused is more on the kind of community side or movement-based, because that's easier to stand up quickly in a time of uncertainty?
I think you've answered your own question, Rachel. I think yes. One thing we have noticed, and we're not sure if this is a trend or not, in Cambridge Social Ventures, it's that all the people applying to join the next cohort this year, it used to be sort of 50-50 male and females. It's a lot more women. For some reason, a lot more women are coming forward to set up social enterprises at the moment, and men have dropped off somewhat. We don't know why. We've got a group of students looking at it, but we don't know why as yet. I think there is a lot of activity and there's a lot of chat. I think one thing, you know, for those of you who, you know, there's been a lot of chat about what's going to happen next and responses to it. But I don't know about you, but at the moment, people seem to be running out of steam. It's a bit like a balloon that's losing sort of air rapidly. As longer we go through this, you know, people's energies are dropping quite a bit. So, thank you, Rachel. James Gemmell, you had a question?
Yeah, it was just one of the positives you mentioned about reconnecting with place and grassroots mutual aid. We saw that a lot at the start of the pandemic, but that kind of, as you say, the kind of energy is waning a little bit. And I just wondered if from the readings or the long view stuff that you've looked at and what does history tell us how we might sustain that, or is it something that we kind of just have to accept?
Well, there's always a spontaneous, you know, activity, but to maintain spontaneous activity, it needs some form of infrastructure. So it needs others to provide support. I think in the UK context, there's a lot of, you know, the government said we're doing X, Y, and Z to support. It never really happened, unless you know better, James. If you want that sort of thing, you need to support it. So one organisation that I think has done incredibly well, partly because I had one of my injections and I noticed, you know, at least 7 of the voluntary service, the Royal Voluntary Service, which was the Women's Voluntary Service, they have a lot of people who do that sort of quiet work, which really supports the rest of us, but they had an infrastructure to start with to support it. So if Cambridge County Council wants it to continue, it has to put in resource to maintain infrastructure. I think it's simple as that. Or someone does. Does that answer your question, James?
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have a counter to it?
Yes, but not for a recorded session.
Okay. Some of the questions. Some parts of the world have not felt the full brunt of the pandemic. Yes. It's interesting. One of my students from the Sudan said, on this topic, yes, COVID is important, but frankly, we've got other things to worry about. And this is partly my comment on, it hides other things because it's so important to us right now. A lot of things have been hidden, things that are of equal, if not more importance, in the global scheme of things, have been hidden, forgotten about, neglected. Lenky, the question.
Hi, Neil. Thank
Hi
you.
there.
Hi there. Sorry, I was just looking for my microphone. Yeah, you mentioned a bit about sort of the role of big government, and I'm just wondering whether you think whether this opportunity now in time is going to lead to some sort of paradigm shift in terms of well, changing just the perspectives around political economy and when and how governments can step in during sort of difficult times.
Governments always have, in different shapes and form, you know, at some point during most pandemics. Whether that will mean that they will think about stepping forward in terms of tackling other issues is moot. I would hope that enough people have now realized that the state and the public sector has got an incredibly important role to play. And my other hope is that people like us start to think that we should get involved in a different way. It's not just about glamorous or exciting or sexy social innovation. It's also about the boring, plodding work of political activity with a small p, you know, which many of us don't touch with a barge pole because, you know, like I said, it's boring. But that work is the backbone of society, and it is where the real power is, if you think about it. And far too many of us just say, no, it's not for us. So I would hope that people might start thinking slightly differently. If local politics could be more exciting, it might help, but, you know, it is what it is at the moment. So, you know, as you know, Lenky, I'm a great believer that we do need to think very carefully about the role of the public sector moving forwards. That, you know, people forget that people like us in academic institutions and many others are supported through the public purse, and that the public purse then provides opportunities for people to set up businesses or patent ideas and then make zillions of pounds out of it, but then they sometimes forget the payback bit, which is taxes, etc. So I think we need to rebalance those sort of things as well. Emily, you had a question?
Yes, now, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. I wonder, how do you think about the social enterprise and the sustainable? You know, we are a social enterprise, and I think you already know we are in Malawi, and our model is quite unique. We thought we are self-sufficient because all the donations, all the income are from our business side, and then we donate to our you know, social enterprise, the charity part. So we always thought we are self-sufficient, or we can say that sustainable, until the pandemic, because the business really bad impacted by the pandemic. So it's declined. So we also did really good quick adaptation. For example, our social enterprise project, rather than produce coffee, and we change our product line. We start to produce the facial mask to meet the marketing's needs. But unfortunately, after almost half a year's performance, it's failed. So until recently, until the pandemic, we realized actually we're not really sustainable. So I would like to have your advice or opinion about this. Thank you.
Well, I mean, so many social enterprises, including yours possibly, are micro-organizations. They're small organizations. And obviously you're trying to do two things. You're trying to make a surplus, a profit, as well as do good. Now, just doing one of those two things is pretty hard. And it's not surprising to me that organizations are struggling, because there's probably struggle anyway with the sort of issues that you are. It's in the nature of the beast, yes? And the problem, and this is very well explained in a book from, I think, 2000 by Professor Ash Amin called Placing the Social Economy. The problem is that societies are expecting people like you and many others in the audience to solve problems at an individual small scale, you know, when those similar problems used to be solved at a more universal sort of public scale. Okay, so we're increasingly relying on entrepreneurial solutions rather than thinking a little more strategically about how to tackle certain issues. Now, I don't think it's either or, but we've gone too far one way. We expect social enterprise to save us all, and frankly, I think we know that it won't. So we have to think of something else, basically. It doesn't mean I'm against social enterprise. I ran one for 13 years. They have their place, but they're not the answer to everything. Yeah. Winnie. Are you there, Winnie? She's wandered off.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Good evening, and thanks so much, Neil, for the very provocative and illuminating perspective on social innovation in the context of the COVID world. My curiosity is whether there will be cynicism around some of the grand challenges that have been illuminated, especially the inequity and all the inequality, especially with the vaccine distribution. So I know countries that are getting quotas, and when you look at the quotas, or specifically like in Kenya, where they've gotten 1.2 million doses for 50 odd million population. Do you think there's a sense that this pandemic will be a tipping point in terms of driving change, not just from social entrepreneurs, but also from governments and from all the non-governmental organizations and other good willing people? Or will it be just another point, a flashpoint in the pan, and people will just think, oh, well, it's a social innovation discussion again, you know? What's your sense?
Well, you know, I would hope that it makes a difference. That's my positive side. So yes, I mean, surely, you know, how many crises and disasters do we have to have before you know, key people wake up and, you know, smell the coffee? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the other side of me also says, well, frankly, you know, we're going to have to have repeated, you know, crises before people actually take action. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think it's beholds people interested in these issues, which you all are because you're here, and a lot of you, you know, are with us in the centre anyway, is that we have to continually think critically about the issues and not just criticize, but provide solutions, or at least, you know, well, yeah, actually try solutions and practice what we preach. You know, practice, you know, the sort of things that we want to see happen. And one would hope would be a critical mass. This again is not new. I mean, if you think about many of the things that we have in the UK, be it the National Health Service, be it libraries or whatever, as much as they've been unravelled, a lot of the ideas that, you know, those in post-1946 activities, you know, happened, they occurred in the 19th century. People thinking about change, people thinking about the crises of their day, people experimenting with libraries, with adult education, with health initiatives, etc. And a lot of those becoming sticky. Yeah. Now, the problem with social innovation at the moment, and you know, you may accuse me of being a bit gloomy here, it's not very sticky, or it's not sticky enough. You know, mm-hmm. There's a lot of style, not a lot of substance, and that's something we really have to think about.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
There's another question, Neil, from James here on the role of government.
Yeah. He's making a statement there.
No, it wasn't a question, sorry. It was just
a statement.
Yeah.
The statement that I think is really good around that, what we talked about.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm not read it, James. I'm sure it's very good because the previous book's very good, but the word moonshot irritates me somewhat. You know, moonshots are fine to a point, but really it's the hard graft that matters. It's that quote from Dr. Bida that matters. That it's the hard graft over time, you know, that really does make a difference.
Okay, are there any more questions from the floor? If not, then this may be a perfect time to say a huge thank you to you, Neil, for, as I said, a really inspiring talk, and also for a wonderful question and answer session, which has been really revealing and thought-provoking. So I'll just invite all of you in the audience to say a thank you, or to do a virtual or whatever clap for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.